So we think about the role of Mary and bringing Jesus to the knowledge of people in their own time and people throughout the world. And certainly one very strong Catholic tradition is that of visionaries. We recognize that there are people who have had remarkable inspiration, people who have had that sense of Mary bringing a special message to them. The big feature about all of these places, I assume so, I don't only really have knowledge of Lourdes, but one of the features about Lourdes is that it's all about Mary bringing the knowledge of her Son to people. It's not a place of devotion to Mary in particular. We honour her and so on, but it certainly isn't a place where we worship Mary. It's a place where we are invited by her to come into the presence of her Son Jesus. It's very much the Christocentric place. Jesus is at the centre of it, rather than Mary. She's the one who points the way. And thinking about the birth of Jesus and the presentation in the temple, similar to our sacrament of baptism, is the fact that, just as mentioned yesterday, one of the main differences between the New Testament and the Old Testament is that the New Testament is all about people themselves. The Old Testament is about people who brought a message of promise, a message of hope. Whereas the New Testament is how that message, that promise, and that message of hope comes directly to people to live that message for themselves and to encourage people to be embraced in that message. And so the people that are very familiar to the vast majority of people in this country and around the world where Christianity is known, people who are important are obviously Mary and Joseph, and you shouldn't forget the donkey. The donkey is important because the donkey brings Mary to the place where Jesus is to be born. We think of the innkeeper, the welcome of the innkeeper, the shepherds, and the wise men. Also in the presentation we think of Simeon and Anna. Anna's often forgotten about. It's the prayer of Simeon that is mentioned most. At last, O powerful Master, your servant can go in peace. It's a great prayer. It's a prayer that would be very appropriate at a funeral. Now you can let your servant go in peace. The problem for the vast majority of Christians, when we come to the talk of assisted dying, is that that prayer of Simeon is very important. You can let your servant go in peace. Not your servant is coming to you in peace. Not your servant has made the decision to come into your presence. We do sometimes pray for people to die, in the sense we pray for them to be in peace. When I was with Joyce McCartan just the day before she died, one of the people who was there was saying to her, it's all right, you can go. But we can only go when we are invited to come into the presence of God. It's a very slippery slope when we make that decision ourselves. It's a very understandable decision with a small number of people, but it's very much the slippery slope. It's a prayer. Now you can let your servant go, if it is your time, if it is my time, if it is your will. Everything is always according to the will of God. So all of those people together are all important. Can't say Mary's important and the others are just bit parts. Everybody's important. I often find if I go to the theatre that at the end it's always, here comes the star of the show. And the star of the show comes in and gets the biggest round of applause and then does the biggest bow. But everybody's important, absolutely everybody. I told the story before of the parish where somebody was always there. never seemed to do much in the sense of not being involved in very much. Came to church, went home again. If there was coffee after Mass, she'd be there, have coffee, go home. Not particularly involved in anything. And then when she died, 2 weeks later, somebody asked a very pertinent question: why is nobody washing these tea towels? Because she was the one who did it, but nobody ever noticed. It's only when she died that it was noticed. And sometimes when people try to do so much for others, it's only when they're not there any longer that it's particularly noticed. It's happened to me a couple of times where, after I've left the parish, some people have said, well, we didn't realise how much you did. Some other people would say, thank God you've gone, because you didn't do very much, I suppose. But lots of things are hidden, lots of things happen that people don't know about. Everybody is important. It's what, sorry to come back down to banal things, but it's what annoys me most about professional football. The fact that when somebody scores the goal these days, they want to be heralded. When it comes to the World Cup and a goal is scored, it takes 2 or 3 minutes for the game to start again, because everybody's going wild. If you look at some of the games from previous years, the 1966 World Cup, somebody scores and they've scored, let's get on with the game. And now it's all about pointing to the name on the back of the shirt and all that sort of thing. Look how wonderful I am. You're only as wonderful as the other 10 players. It's no good saying, I scored the winning goal. The goalkeeper did 5 blinding saves. He's the one who won the game for you, really. There's too much emphasis on the one individual. Everybody is important in the story, even the donkey. Without the donkey, Mary would not have got to Bethlehem to give birth to Jesus. If it hadn't been for the innkeeper, there wouldn't have been a place for them to go. Everybody is important. And the message that all of these people receive, or the message that they bring to the story, are very important and very individual. The shepherds were people who you didn't invite to dinner in your house. Quite simply, they had a horrendous smell. If you've ever been close to a sheep, it's not particularly, you want to make sure you've got a handkerchief handy to stop the smell, because it's horrendous. The shepherds literally lived with the sheep. They were the lowest of the low. They were the untouchables almost. If you think of the Indian caste system, they were the ones at the very bottom. Nobody was interested in them because they were not social people. But they're the ones who come to witness the birth of Jesus. It emphasizes one very strong thing that will be repeated over and over again throughout the Gospel. The message is for all people, rich and poor alike, old and young, absolutely everybody, no exceptions, not even the shepherds. It's not just coincidence, not just that the shepherds happened to be there nearby. It wouldn't have been all that near because the sheepfolds were quite away from where people lived. They had to travel to get in there, to get there to meet Jesus. Everybody, but everybody is important. And the presence of the wise men, the magi, the people who travelled from the east, is a message that it's not just about status, it's not just about who you are in your own society, it's about where you live in the world. There are no exceptions. There are no exceptions in terms of people, no exceptions in terms of countries or races. The message of the gospel is available in all parts of the world. I was talking to somebody a few weeks ago who'd been to, I forget which country it was now, somewhere in the Far East, and was saying that there's hardly any evidence at all of Christianity. And yet, I believe there are more people go to Christian churches in China than go to churches in this country, throughout Europe. And yet it's a atheist society, and I think probably similar thing about Russia. So many people who have faith, it's very much hidden, but it's a faith that's there. The message of the gospel is for all nations, for all peoples. When we come to the presentation, Jesus being taken to the temple for the important ritual for a son being born into a family, we have Simeon and Anna, two incredibly important people, because they are the ones who truly recognize who Jesus is. Anna is, say, often forgotten, but what it says about Anna was that she was 80 years old. It's incredibly old in those days. It's not exactly young these days, but certainly isn't old. In those days it was very, very old. 40 was beyond really the average expectation, which is why people got married very, very young, because they would expect to be dead before they were 40. So to be 80 is amazing. It says she spent her whole day in prayer in the temple. That is not understandable to many, many people. Why would somebody with only a short life left, why would they spend it all in a temple? I remember the TV series, really going back to the 60s or early 70s. I think it was called Doomwatch, but I'm not too sure. But all I can remember about it is one scene. In this scene, there's two people who are the sort of main characters. And for some reason, they go to visit this old guy who lives on his own and spends all of his time looking after the garden, digging the garden and so on. And one of the people, he says, why does he waste his time do that? And he finds a rotavator in the shed. He gets the rotavator out and shows this old guy how the rotavator can dig up the garden much, much more quickly than he does. And then the other person says to the man who wanted to use the rotavator, well, what's he going to do now? And the fellow says, he can do whatever he wants to do. And she says, he wants to dig the garden. That's what he wanted to do, and you've taken that away from him. If you had a situation with someone like Anna saying, you've only got a short time left, you need to get out and enjoy yourself. I am enjoying myself, she would say. I am where I want to be. We can sometimes misunderstand people, misunderstand the places they want to be, misunderstand the things they want to do. That applies in every sense. Religious people can misunderstand people who are not religious, not understand. I can't understand why children spend hours and hours on computer games that just seem to be pointless. But they do, and they find fulfillment in that. Whether it's a good thing or not is open to question. I just simply don't understand it. I don't understand people who go out and get drunk and then say, we've had a wonderful time. I remember in Darlington, I was just a teenager at the time, and we were coming outside of a pub on Yarm Road in Darlington. Somebody was being violently sick in the gutter outside, and someone else was saying, oh, she's had a good time. And I thought, how on earth is that a good time? But it was for them. Who am I to criticize? It was the aftermath, perhaps, of a good time. She'd had a good time, then she paid the price for it afterwards. With lots of things that we don't understand. Anna is a very, very impressive character. She's somebody who had that real sense of the presence of God in her life. She had a vision, really, of everlasting life. When we come to heaven, we won't say, oh, it's nice to have met God. I wonder what else is going to happen around here. I wonder what else there is to see. We will simply be in the presence of God. We want to capture that moment. Often people think, we use that phrase in church, forever and ever. Well, the new translation, I forget what it is now, new translation doesn't say forever and ever. It's for ages unending or something like that. What's wrong with forever and ever? There's one thing wrong with forever and ever, in the sense that things that go on and on and on, no matter how wonderful they are, will eventually get boring. I'm not suggesting you'll be bored in heaven, but if it's something that just goes on and on and on, if on the other hand it's something where you capture a moment in time, we've all probably had that experience, a moment of, this is fantastic. And so if only I could stay here, if only I could be here. It's how Peter, James and John were at the top of the mountain where Jesus was transfigured. Let's just stay here, I want nothing more than this. Same is true in a negative sense as well. People who have an addiction, nothing else matters, nothing else whatsoever. People can get out of a car after a long journey to an airport, got to go and have a cigarette. The fact that you're going to be late for the plane doesn't matter. What matters is you have the cigarette. That's a real addiction. It's a real problem for a lot of people. But the positive side is there are situations in our lives when we really want to hold on to that moment. I've had that experience on one particular time when, as many of you know, I adopted a boy from Zambia, and when he went back, he was refused a visa to return, but eventually we managed to get a visa. He travelled here on his own. He was 21, I think, by then. But there were all kinds of things went through my mind, things that could go wrong. We've had problems at immigration in Zambia, and problems immigration in Heathrow Airport as well at different times. And I kept thinking all the things that could go wrong. I was waiting at Newcastle Airport, and then through if you're familiar with the domestic arrivals, because you've flown in from Heathrow, and there's a sort of glass door, and you can see people coming. It's not a glass door, but as the door opens, you can see people coming. And I suddenly saw this Newcastle United football shirt, and I knew he'd arrived. If I could have held on to that moment for the rest of my life, I'd have been very happy. Of course, it's totally practical because we have to live our lives, but that to me is heaven, where you have that experience, come into the presence of God. Nothing else is important. Nothing else matters. We don't look for other things. We're in the presence of God. We would simply want to stay there. Anna had that experience. She knew that. She knew what it was to be in the presence of God. If she'd been born many years later, she was born in the world today, exposition would have been a fantastic thing for her, because she wouldn't have just seen a shiny gold-coloured thing up here. She would have really recognised the presence of Jesus. And one of the reasons for having this 40 hours exposition is for us to try and grow in our understanding, our appreciation. This truly is Jesus. And Simeon, as I mentioned before, was somebody who recognised that his life was fulfilled. Anna was continuing to live her life. Simeon thought, well, that's it, I don't need any more. I need no more experiences in my whole life. I have seen the Messiah. I have seen the Son of God. Nothing but nothing else is important. Presentation is a thing where, in a sense, Mary and Joseph bring Jesus to the information, to the knowledge of other people, but it's their response that is the important thing. It's what they have to say, how they live their lives that's important. And that's where we stand. We stand alongside Simeon and Anna. It's how we respond to the knowledge that God is very much with us. The promise that the coming of Jesus into the world is a promise that is associated very, very definitely with children. A child is something very, very precious, very special. It's why we find it abhorrent when children are hurt, children are damaged, when children are killed, sometimes more often by their parents than anybody else. We find it abhorrent because a child is the symbol of innocence and always the symbol of hope. With a child, you have that sense of the continuation of your life. Many grandparents, great-grandparents, when they come to the end of their days, will look at their grandchildren and think, well, I live on through them. Sometimes it's people have asked me that question, you're a priest, you don't have children, your name doesn't carry on. It's not the name that's important, and many people are understanding that today. At one time, brides always took their husband's name. They don't always do that today, because it's not the name that's important, it's the spirit that's important. I've never had children, but I can think of many situations in life where I think about how I've perhaps had an effect on people's lives and how I live on through others. I have an email that was sent to me yesterday by somebody I knew since he was 9 years old. He's a chef, and he was showing me some pictures of cakes that he's made. Then he said, I hate doing cakes. I thought, gosh, what are you going to do if it's something you really want to do? I don't know. But it's amazing that he still remembers who I am, still remembers the fact that I actually taught him, taught him or gave him the opportunity of doing some work in the kitchen when he was just very, very young. He remembers that. There's so many situations. I get phone calls every day from Zambia from people, sometimes just to say hello, sometimes wanting things, but sometimes just to say hello. A couple of weeks ago, I hadn't spoken to him for a couple of days. I miss you. He missed not speaking to me in over 2 days on the phone. It's just that connection with people. Our lives live on. People are very, very interested these days in their heritage, trying to find out some information about those who've gone before them. Sometimes you find out things you wish you hadn't discovered. But people are interested in family. It's not just about biological family. The family of the church is of great importance. Jesus came into the world to bring people into his family. The Holy Family is Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, but it's an outward-looking family, as all good families are, looking outwards towards other people. And generally, bigger families tend to bring in more children, in the sense that bigger families are where other children want to be, because there's that sense of togetherness, that sense of belonging. The thing about the promise is not always positive. The promise of Jesus coming into the world is a promise of beauty, promise of togetherness, but it's also a recognition that things are not always simple and straightforward. It's a recognition that there is suffering. Simeon warns Mary that a sword will pierce her heart, that she will suffer. And when it came to her at the foot of the cross that we'll look at on Thursday, that suffering became very real. Accepting suffering is not easy. It's never easy. Again, that's why assisted dying is such a problem for Christian people, certainly to look at from the outside. I'm not thinking of in terms of people being involved in it, but looking from the outside, because suffering is not easy. You can't make it easy by bringing an end to it and bringing an end to your life as well. You don't know what suffering you compound, what difficulties there are for the people left behind afterwards. Just think about people who take their own lives. They cannot possibly be in their right mind. They cannot possibly stop and think the consequences. Somebody has to find them. Somebody has to be shocked and saddened, deeply saddened, that they've taken their own lives. Because bringing an end to your own suffering does not bring an end necessarily to the suffering of others. I remember I was talking to somebody recently, and she was saying how she'd been with a couple with not quite a newborn child, but a child that wasn't walking yet, and she'd held the baby for a while, and she said, "Thank you for lending your baby to me." And the mother said, which I found very strange, "Oh, you could have him for the whole day if you want." Sometimes you'd say that, perhaps jokingly, sometimes you might say it truthfully. It would be nice to have a few hours of rest and peace. Babies are not always easy. All of you who are parents know that far better than I do. but nothing brings greater joy than a child. A friend of mine who was very eloquent, he was a tutor in philosophy, could argue that black was white, and really always had the right words and what have you. And I remember him saying when his first child was born, he picked up this baby and thought, I don't know what to say. He was just completely overcome. I remember listening to somebody talking about children, and they had a few children, and he said, I'd pick up this baby, just been born, and I'd be filled with love for this baby. For no reason whatsoever, no logical reason. Why should you love this bundle of flesh? It's done nothing for you. But you do, because babies have that great sense of promise for the future, great sense of joy. It's not all about joy. There's a lot of suffering involved, sometimes heartache. But it's something very, very precious, very special. And Jesus being born as a baby, being seen and welcomed by other people is very important. This is the fulfillment, the beginning of the fulfillment of promises going back a long, long time. So we have to ask ourselves, what does all of this mean? What does this coming time of Christmas mean for us? Sadly, for a lot of people, Christmas begins in November and finishes on Boxing Day. I'll never forget being in Florida on Christmas time, and driving to somebody's house about 7 o'clock on Christmas Day, Christmas night, and someone had thrown their Christmas tree away. It was in the front garden. Whether they'd had two and that was a spare one, I'm not so sure, but it just looked really good. And also, when I got up the following day, I realised this wasn't Boxing Day, this was just 26th of December. Christmas was over. But it isn't, that's when it's begun. The season of Christmas begins with midnight mass, 12 o'clock. It's called midnight mass, Christmas Eve mass. It's actually Christmas Day mass, Christmas morning. It's the beginning of the Christmas season, right through to February the 2nd, the Feast of the Presentation. That's the season of Christmas. We've lost that in our society completely. Christmas is what comes before. Everything is about anticipation. Everybody wants to celebrate everything early, instead of celebrating at the time of, I think I mentioned last year, one of the great sad things is that in January, when it's still quite dark, the lights are all switched off on the streets. If they didn't put the lights on until Christmas Eve, and they kept them on all through January, perhaps the January blues wouldn't be so real. But we put everything onto Christmas Day and New Year's Day. And then January the 2nd comes and it's the start of the rest of the year. Those are the times we should be celebrating. We need to be people who really embrace the presence of Jesus in our world today. How we are welcoming towards others. The shepherds were welcomed, the wise men were welcomed, Simeon and Anna were welcomed. All people were welcomed into the presence of Jesus. We need to ask ourselves, how welcoming are we? Do we allow people to come close to us? And also, when times are difficult in our lives, do we rant and rail against God? We might as well, because God will always forgive us when we change our minds. But are we prepared to accept the difficulties of life? But above all, we accept the suffering that comes. We do not seek it. It's one of the big mistakes in the history of the church, and still today. There are people who think you have to suffer. It has to be hard, it has to be difficult. It doesn't. If it is hard and it is difficult, then yes, we should never be trying to make things harder or more difficult than they are. We accept what comes our way. We don't seek anything negative. And above all, the message, which is the message of the first week of Advent, is there is always hope. Jesus brings that great message. There's always hope. Things seemed hopeless when he was born, but yet everything worked out. Herod's soldiers came looking for him. It worked out well in the end for him, not so for the other children. Sadly, that's the problem. We bring something of joy into the world. We bring a great message. Some people don't like it. They want to fight against it. Jesus on the cross seemed to be the end. All hope was lost, and yet it wasn't. Jesus comes into our world to encourage each one of us to recognize this is something incredibly special. And through Mary, this message has come into the world, began to come into the world. She presented Jesus to the world. We pray that we can do our part in presenting Jesus to the world of today.